To everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Mark Wilf, the Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Jewish Federations of North America. Hope you and your families are all safe and well. First, a few technical notes. You are on mute and are hidden from view. We will hear first from our three speakers, the first one before moving to Q&A. If you have a question, please submit your questions to the Q&A section on the Zoom and include your name and community when you write. We will be monitoring the chat and will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. As everyone who has joined us here today knows, the government of Israel is currently discussing whether to incorporate land currently governed by Israel's Judea and Samaria civil administration into the state of Israel. In other words, they are discussing the possibility of annexing land in the West Bank. But what does annexation really mean? And with a new government in Israel and most Israeli citizens focused on economic woes and coronavirus recovery, what is likely to happen? To help us understand the facts, we are fortunate to have a distinguished panel of experts who represent a variety of positions and opinions. To begin with, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Shira Efron, to outline the basics of what could take place as early as July 1st. Dr. Efron is one of the leading global experts on Israeli policy analysis. She is a special advisor on Israel with the RAND Corporation. Shira, what are we likely to see in the coming months, and will Israel annex parts of the West Bank, and what could be the implications of such a move? Shira?
Thank you very much for having me. I hope you can hear me better now. Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you all for joining us. I hope you and your loved ones are safe. I really appreciate your interest in this topic, given all the other issues that you're facing in the United States and all around the world. I'll try to be brief, touching upon where we are at this moment, and I look forward to your questions in the second round. I fear that I don't have much news beyond what you see in the news, because at this point, even though the process of annexation could well begin on July 1, this is the date that the coalition agreement has defined as the agreement that annexation could be brought to an Israeli cabinet decision. There is no certainty. We don't know what might happen on July 1, whether it's a very symbolic declaration or annexation of up to 30% of the West Bank, which is what we've been hearing about, and we can, talk about these areas, but essentially it's all the Jordan Valley and all the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. But I think it's mind-boggling that a week before the date, we have no certainty what is likely to happen. And I think this reflects, my assessment is that the Prime Minister himself is not convinced what he's going to do, what the government is going to do. There's pushback from different actors. There's encouragement from others. And it is not clear. My personal assessment, and I wouldn't put money on it, I think they're not going to go for the full Monty, what we would call the full 30% of the West Bank. I think we're likely to see something more symbolic because of this pushback, because of the pushback from the international community, the Europeans. There's a strong pushback from Jordan. There is pushback from the Arab world, and there's going to be a meeting in the White House which would decide if the administration is going to okay this move. So at this point, I'm not sure what we're likely to see, but I suspect we will probably end up with some sort of a declaration that Israel is about to, and of course the term that's going to be used is Israel is going to extend the law or apply sovereignty of different parts of the West Bank, maybe starting a process on July 1, which may not necessarily take place on July 1, but slowly over the summer. This is where I think we are. But I think that's really important. It brings me to my second point. As you know, and I'm not gonna talk about where I am on this. I have my assessments and my analysis on where I am on this move. But no matter where you are, whether you're pro annexation or extending sovereignty, applying the law, these are all euphemisms. Those are the same things. However, no matter where you stand on this, there's no question this is a big move. Israel has held on to this territory for 53 years now and has avoided taking such a step. Nonetheless, there is no assessment process, analysis process that at least the government led, looking at the risks and opportunities, which I'm sure my colleague, fellow on the panel, who I really look forward to hearing, Odette Ravivi from Efrat, is going to speak about the opportunities. But we have yet to see some assessment that says, you know what, this what might happen, but here are the costs, here are the possible benefits, here's the risk analysis. My formal training is in policy planning. This is what I've been doing. This is my PhD is in it. That's what I've been doing the last 20 years. And when you take such this is such a significant move in either direction, you need to assess the risks and the process. And there is no thought process behind it, at least in terms of integrating the different stakeholders in Israeli society, and also the officials that would have to be responsible for this. I'll give you an example. Today I had two conversations with security officials, clandestine agencies, and IDF. And those are people on the ground on the West Bank, very high-ranking generals, and more, let's say, no low-rank but mid-rank officers. And all said the same thing. They have no idea what is coming. They are trying to toy with different scenarios to think how it will affect them, but they don't know. Do they need to recruit reserves? Do they need to deploy differently? What are they preparing for? And this is something that that we can't, when we want to talk about the implications, we can't refer to a government-led study, which is a shame. In the absence of a government-led study, I will talk about the implications from analysis that was done primarily by the Commanders for Israel Security. It's a group of over 300 high-ranking generals. It's at the rank of a two-star general and above and over. Former heads of Mossad, Shin Bet, IDF, and I must say their study is not flawless. I was a peer reviewer. I was an official reviewer to the study, and at the time when they did it a year ago, when it was published a year and a half ago, I thought that the risks were overstated, and I said so. However, as reality has evolved, I think that their assessment is correct. The first thing, and then I think this is where many are trying to assess, okay, our threats are overblown. Are the threats we are hearing credible? The Palestinian Authority, which you like it, you don't like it, but the fact is that over the past, since Oslo, the Oslo process started, the Palestinian Authority has been governing the lives of almost now 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank in a way that alleviates the burden. The Israeli government does not have to manage the lives of the Palestinians in the West Bank. Well, this Palestinian Authority has always, since 2015, they said, well, if there's no peace process, we will dismantle the PA. Israel can assume responsibility for if Israel wants the land, they can take the people. These were empty threats until now. They've essentially cut all coordination with Israel, all coordination at the high level, but also at the lower level. And again, conversations today on the ground from officers that have been working in the West Bank for so many years, and they're saying they can't even reach them by phone. Why is this problematic? We could go to the long-term effects, but even in the short term, there's a new outbreak of COVID-19 in Israel and in the West Bank. You need coordination. These are contiguous territories. We have mixed populations there. There is no one to talk to even about that. So this is just an example. But what happens is this with this Palestinian strategy of burning down the house, if you will, because they figure that if they don't do it, the world will not listen. It means that they're not receiving the tax that is the tax revenue that Israel collects on their behalf, and that's part of the agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. They don't have the ability to provide services to their constituents, and they don't have the ability to pay salaries. I heard today an official within the international community, who's someone who's known to be pretty optimistic about this, and this person said that the Palestinian Authority may not last beyond September. Again, you may like it, you may not like the PA. This is not the issue. The issue is that if the PA collapses and there's no authority to govern the lives of 3 million Palestinians, who will do it? That can fall onto the laps of Israel. It has other, it has implications for Israel's Jewish nature, of course, with 3 million additional non-Jews. If they don't get full rights, which most likely they will not get, it says something about the democratic nature of Israel. It has security implications because we're talking about friction between populations, and it does have also economic implications. This is with the full scenario, and it may not happen, but if you just look at the numbers, you say, okay, if Israel absorbs now this number of Palestinians, it would cost the Israeli taxpayers $14 billion annually. The Ambassador Dan Shapiro is on the line. He negotiated an MOU. The number is $3.8 billion annually. We're talking about $14.5 billion annually, the cost of just absorbing the West Bank. Will this all happen? I don't know. I'm not sure. Is there a risk that it will happen? Very possibly so. Can we have a risk assessment? Is the Israeli public aware of what's at stake here? Could maybe half of it happen? This is the conversation that is very much missing, and here are the implications that we are seeing.
Shira, thank you so much. And next, I'd like to look at the American side of the equation, and I'm truly honored to welcome our next speaker, a longtime friend of Jewish Federation's former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro. Ambassador Shapiro, who's today a distinguished visiting fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, has also served as Senior Director for the Middle East and North Africa at the National Security Council at the White House. Ambassador Shapiro, what can you tell us about the American perspectives, and when we look at these possible moves, what could that mean for the political landscape in the U.S.? Ambassador.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be with you. Great to be with JFNA, and great to be with good friends and colleagues Shir Efron and Oded Ravivi on this panel. So I'll say a couple of things up front just to clear a couple of points. One is that I see already in the chat there's some question, and this was also in different publication of this webinar, the question of, is there a difference between applying sovereignty or annexation? The two terms, or applying Israeli law, are sometimes being used. I think we should somewhat dispense with the semantics about it. I'm not a lawyer. I won't make a legal case that it's one or the other. I think they amount to the same thing. They amount to an Israeli decision to act unilaterally to determine the status of these territories. That's quite at odds with how we have handled those questions previously. It's long been the U.S. policy and actually U.S.-Israeli agreement that resolutions to the status of territories and other aspects of final status should be achieved through negotiations between the two sides, not unilateral. And this will be seen certainly by most of the world as annexation of, whether you call it occupied territory, whether you call it disputed territory, as some Israelis prefer the term. It will be seen as an annexation. So I just wanted to hit that point up front. I'll talk for a few moments about U.S. interests as I understand them, about some of what we're seeing in the process of and the arguments that are being put forward for annexation. And the last thing I'll just mention is the search for a better or a lesser version of this unilateral annexation than maybe the one that is in the Trump plan. And now, of course, I don't speak for the current administration. Obviously, this situation we find ourselves in results in large part from the publication of President Trump's peace vision in January of this year, in which for the first time he actually called for a two-state solution and used that term and published the vision and published a map, a conceptual map in which Israel would keep roughly 30% of the West Bank. Palestinians in that scenario, if they negotiated a state, met various conditions, might get some swap territories as well. But then following the announcement of that plan came the question of whether Israel could act immediately to annex the areas designated for it in the plan. And there seemed to be immediately a division within the US administration, some officials saying, yes, it should happen immediately, others saying, no, not until later. And I think to some degree, we sense there is still such a division, or at least a discussion within the US administration, maybe happening today in the White House, about whether it's appropriate and helpful to the advancement of the full plan, which indeed does call for two states, even if the Palestinian state is quite constrained, or if it even can be defined as a state, or whether, again, annexation should happen as of July 1st, which the Israeli coalition agreement permits if the United States agrees. So these US discussions are very, very important. Now, I will just now shift from trying to analyze the current administration and just give you my own analysis. I, of course, start from the proposition that the US has both a moral and a strategic interest in ensuring Israel's security. It's our only democratic ally in the Middle East. It's never known a day without its security and legitimacy being challenged. And its ability and right to defend itself is something that not just benefits Israel's survival, but it actually helps the United States manage all of our interests in the Middle East. And it's not a one-way relationship. We benefit, the United States benefits greatly from it as well, in intelligence, and joint training, and technology and the like. And I'm very proud of the MOU that Shira referenced, the $38 billion agreement that is now being implemented to sustain that. But I see unilateral annexation potentially harming US interests in a couple of ways. One, it's going to take what has really been a very relatively stable situation in which Israelis and Palestinians do engage in very professional security cooperation. That's the testimony of every Israeli security official who's involved in it, that prevents acts of terrorism. And it could introduce tension, serious tensions that leads to that breakdown. Now, I'm not sure it will break down over time. There is the question of whether the Palestinian Authority will survive for a few months if it's turning down the revenues that it operates on. But I do think if you look to the medium term, Abu Mazen, President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority is clearly nearing the end of his political career. And once he is no longer on the scene, it's very hard to imagine a Palestinian leader who could justify to their people the maintenance of an authority that cannot credibly be seen as a stepping stone toward a two-state solution. That's just not to suggest Palestinians don't bear plenty of responsibility for previous failed negotiations, or staying away from negotiations, or turning down other offers. But if the goal is to convince them to accept a reasonable two-state solution, that reasonable two-state solution needs to be available and possible to achieve on the ground. And it's not represented by any map in which Israel annexes 30% of the West Bank. When you get that situation, that's the situation that Shira described, where as the Palestinian Authority melts away and Israel is drawn back into the main population centers of the West Bank, where 3 million Palestinians live, that's where you get a deep injury to Israel's security, but also a major challenge to Israel's Jewish and democratic character. That's the binational state that somebody very significant in Israel has told me for many years must be avoided at all costs. The person who told me that is Prime Minister Netanyahu. As we sat in our negotiations with him during my years in government, he was determined to prevent Israel from becoming a binational state in which there's roughly equivalent Jewish and Arab populations between the Jordan and River and the Mediterranean, all under one political entity, and with Israel having to decide whether to provide these Palestinians with citizenship or not, one affecting its Jewish character, one its democratic character. Now, there are other potential injuries to U.S. interests, possible serious tension with Jordan, even destabilization of Jordan. Jordan is a great security partner of Israel, but it's also a linchpin of security in the entire region, which as a US partner helps us manage Syria and ISIS and Iraq and many other regional challenges. And the King of Jordan is saying this could be so destabilizing because of the reaction of Jordan's Palestinian population to events on the other side of the Jordan River that it really could put his regime at stake, could put the peace treaty with Israel at some risk. That obviously could be injurious to US regional interests as well. And then seeing Israel have to respond to all of these scenarios that could be that could unfold, I think really can introduce serious tensions into the security partnership between the United States and Israel. It's a absolutely mutually beneficial partnership, and it has strong bipartisan support in the United States. But once Israel begins to face those impossible dilemmas about how Israel can sustain its Jewish and democratic character, that's the basis of the common values aspect of our partnership. But that is going to weaken bipartisan support. Frankly, there's a lot of public opinion polling that shows it weakens support among younger Americans of both political parties for the kind of partnership that we've had enduring from one administration to another through the years. And I would add that the timing is particularly bad. The negative reaction that I just described will certainly be exacerbated by a decision to push through a unilateral annexation just months or even weeks before a very competitive American election, in a situation where one entire political party, and there is really unanimity, consensus within the Democratic Party, is saying loud and clear, we believe this is harmful to US interests, please don't do this. And not just anybody in the party. I mean, Israel's closest friends, best supporters in the parties, people like Joe Biden and Steny Hoyer and Chuck Schumer and Michelle Flournoy and John Allen and Dan Shapiro. I'll put myself in that category. Forgive me for speaking in a third person. I've been watching Michael Jordan on The Last Dance lately. But those are the voices within the party, the people who have really put their lives and careers dedicated to ensuring Israel's security in this partnership, who are saying, in the spirit of friendship, this is not a good time to do this, and it would certainly get Israel off on a very difficult note with the Democratic administration. The second thing, I'll just reiterate a couple of Shira's points about the process. This is a very confused way to make a very important strategic decision. Every day in the Israeli press, I'm in Israel now, we read multiple completely contradictory stories about the form that the unilateral annexation would take. Some say it's the full 30% envisioned in the Trump plan. Some say it'll be even more than that, because there are some folks in the settler communities who say that's not enough and they need additional annexed land, or they even want to annex the whole thing. Some say it'll be just the Jordan Valley, or just the settlement blocks, or the outlying settlements, or some combination of those three areas. Every day we read something different. What's clear is that nobody has seen a map, not an authorized one anyway, and that includes the IDF. The IDF are the ones who will have to, of course, implement the annexation and defend the new borders. They haven't seen a map. They are also the ones, by the way, raising the concerns about the immediate security risks of violence. I'm not making that case, but they are making that case. But they clearly haven't been seriously consulted, and they don't know what scenario they're preparing for. And that's a strange way to make a decision with really significant strategic national security and societal consequences, and consequences for Israel's most important relationship, with its closest ally, the United States. The last thing I'll just mention is that in the course of hearing these different versions, it's clear that some people are searching for a better version of unilateral annexation, a lesser version. And I really want to suggest that there is no better form of unilateral annexation. As I mentioned, it's been a long-standing principle by the United States through many administrations, agreed with every Israeli government, that unilateral steps by both sides are not how this conflict can be settled. It has to be done through negotiations. Any unilateral annexation of the West Bank, whether it's 1 or 3% or whether it's 30%, is a real violation of that principle. Even if it involves areas of the West Bank that have been proposed for Israel to keep in earlier negotiations as a result of land swaps. Once the lid, of course, is ripped off of unilateral measures, it's quite expectable that the Palestinians will respond with unilateral measures of their own. And I don't know what they could be, but they could be unilateral declarations of independence. They could be further confronting Israel in international tribunals. These are things the United States has always, and I think should always resist. But other countries, the Europeans and others, may find that in response to Israeli unilateral measures, they will be willing to accept Palestinian unilateral measures. And the last point I will just make is that every proposal for a more limited unilateral annexation very openly says this is just the first step. This is just the first step. And it's really just to lower the initial opposition, and we'll come back and do more later. There is a kind of inexorable quality to that advancement. There will be security arguments made about why additional areas need to be annexed to secure the areas that have already been annexed. There will be equity arguments made about how settlers in some communities are treated and others communities are treated. And we'll be on a slippery slope with a precedent set that will be very, very hard to reverse. Mark, I will stop there and turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And finally, for a different perspective, I'd like to turn to Mayor Oded Revivi, who's the mayor of Efrat and one of the leading voices in the Yeshat Council, which represents Jewish settlements. Mayor Revivi, do the settlers support these actions?
So good afternoon. Extremely honored, humbled, and excited to try and answer all the questions which I can feel out there in the webinar, especially after Ambassador Dan Shapiro and Shira presented so well the case as to why not to do anything at the moment. But I'm one of those that has been involved with this administration and the plan, I would say, even from day one. I've been the mayor of Efrat for almost 12 years. I was a lawyer beforehand. When I ran for office in 2008, I thought I was going to become a manager of the city. I didn't anticipate being in a webinar like this, trying to explain policy issues which have to deal with international relationships between different countries. And as I said, when President Trump was elected and he nominated Jason Greenblatt to be his special envoy to the Middle East, I was one of those who was asked to brief him from day one on his first visit in Israel as to how we see the reality in Judea and Samaria. And last January, I was in DC when the president made his announcement, and I have to say that I think the plan is actually an extremely smart and clever move. I think it is a game changer. I think that it might be an opportunity that we don't know when will come back, and I'll try in the short time that I have explain why. Basically, going back to when Jason Greenblatt arrived the first time in Israel, I said to him that traditionally we know there are two sets of plans on the table. There's the one-state plan and there's this two-state plan. But being honest with ourselves, we know that both plans have got very difficult questions which haven't been answered throughout the generations. However, it seems every single time we try to resolve it in exactly the same mannerism, gathered a group of leaders, came out with a resolution, declaration, announcement, and then tried to implement it. If we go through the line of history, we see that it didn't really matter if there was a one state, a two state, or no state. The conflict has been present in this region. There was a conflict prior to 1967 when there were no Jews in Judea and Samaria. The plans going back to 1968, the Rogers Plan, always talked about withdrawing back to the Green Line, which is not an official border, but it's really the border of the ceasefire going back to the War of Independence in 1948, evacuating people from their homes, and basically all the plans which came up until now to the table didn't create a better reality than what we were experiencing. When the plan was introduced, the reason I thought it was a clever move was because it has some anchors, some ideas, which basically look at the whole conflict in a slightly different perspective, which the administration said they do not want to repeat the mistakes that were done in the past, and they want to come with something new. The idea that nobody needs to be evacuated from their homes is a new concept that hasn't been introduced up until now. When you eliminate the personal question and you tell all individuals that their home is secure, you immediately eliminate protest of people that might feel that they're going to lose their houses. The second thing, which was extremely important, the way the plan was introduced, was that for the first time, the Palestinians have been denied the ability to have a veto power over negotiating peace. Because the deal, the process starts even before the Palestinians will say we agree or we don't agree. And that is a big changer, because all the previous plans, we always came to a deadlock, because it didn't matter how long the negotiation took place. It didn't matter how much was on the table offered. The Palestinians had a veto power to end it when they wanted. They tried this trick with this administration by basically not showing up to any invitation that they had from the American administration to come and negotiate. So the process starts, and here we have to be very accurate and very careful, and I completely don't accept Shira and Ambassador Shapiro's trying to confuse the definitions. What is being suggested on day one is extremely clear, is applying Israeli law on the areas where we have today Jewish people who live in Judea and Samaria. The reason the maps are not so significant for this time is because the areas where the Jews actually live are very certain, are very known. So the administration did add a conceptual map to the plan, a conceptual map which raised many questions, many disputes. Even within the settler community, there are those who accept the map, and there are those who want to make amendments to the map, and those who don't accept the map at all. But the truth of the matter is that they could have concluded it in one sentence without any map, just saying that Israeli law will apply where there are Jews who live today in Judea and Samaria. There are legal implications for the private individuals who live in Judea and Samaria, that after 53 years or after 70 years, they're actually going to have a legal framework which is going to be clear, because today we're governed by military order, which sometimes applies Israeli law, which has been legislated by the parliament. In some instances, we still are being governed by Jordanian law, and in even worse situations, we're being governed by the Ottoman law, which was legislated 115, 500 years ago, and is completely irrelevant to the time and mannerism and transactions and property issues that we're dealing with today. The second stage of the plan will be a stage where there are preliminary conditions that I think every individual attending this webinar, any individual that is seeking peace, will definitely accept. The Palestinians need to accept upon themselves that they are stopping to fund families of terrorists. They need to dematerialize Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip. They need to recognize the right of the Jewish people to have a Jewish state. Things that we've been claiming and arguing for decades. And now these are the preliminary conditions to start the negotiation. Only if these conditions are met, then we actually go into a period of up to 4 years of negotiation, because there needs to be direct negotiation, there needs to be direct talk, there needs to be agreement on all the issues which are on the ground and have to do with everyday's life, including the final maps. And then it will lead up to a Palestinian state, an independent Palestinian state. Now, here some of my peers are extremely upset and afraid to actually say that. My answer to them is very clear. We have already a Palestinian entity within us in Judea and Samaria, because going back to the Oslo Accord, there was a division of the land to areas A, B, and C. If I travel up and down Judea and Samaria today, after a very short period of time, I come in front of a red big sign saying no entry. Israelis are not allowed to go in. If you go in, you risk your own life. Why? Because that's the Palestinian Authority. So when we have that already as a reality, I don't see much of a change in that respect, that we are risking or we're agreeing to something that we haven't agreed in the past. Now, the way the plan was built, the fact that we're seeing where people Jews live, where Arabs live, has created a new dimension to the dialogue. And we see that only now, when the Palestinians have started to see that the plan might be implemented, now all of a sudden they're showing signs, you know what, we might be able to walk into negotiations, to consulting with us. They have been invited for the last 3.5 years. They are still invited, but the deal, according to what I see, according to what I hear, according to what I understand, is going to go forward according to the stages that the administration has determined. It is important to note that this deal hasn't been originated by the State of Israel. It's actually been originated by the United States, the American administration, looking through the eyes of the American interest, trying to benefit for the United States, and also benefiting its strongest ally in Judea and Samaria, in the State of Israel. As a lawyer, one of the days I got frustrated, and before I left the profession, I told my secretary that, you know, half of our clients are liars. Why? Because I come to court, I argue their case. The other side comes to the court and argues their case. Each one hires their own experts, and they argue the line of argument as to what the lawyer asked them to argue. So just like Shira quoted some experts, the former National Security Council, the head of the National Security Council, Yaakov Nagal, doesn't see any threat in the Palestinian Authority actually collapsing. We know that the Palestinian Authority relies heavily on Israeli aid, on American aid, and it is true that Israel has an interest that the Palestinian Authority will carry on being effective because of all the issues in cooperation. But also the Arab world is in an extremely unique situation where we haven't had that in the past. In the past, the Arab countries were torn between alliance with the United States or with the former Soviet Union. Here, all of a sudden, their dilemma is between the United States and Iran. And I think you all will agree with me that they want to join forces with the United States. And that's why, even if they are saying that they have hesitations about this plan, at the end of the day, when they will have to make a decision, they will line up with the American administration. Now, it is true that we are coming towards American elections, and Dan is right that maybe it is too close to elections. But the administration that Dan was representing made some very serious decisions very close to elections, like the MOU that he's so proud and we're happy with, but that basically made decisions and determined foreign aid to Israel from the United States, basically forcing the next elected president to act upon what they wanted to do just 2 months before the election. But the former administration did something even worse. After the elections, after they knew that the new president elected was President Trump, they decided not to veto a decision that was brought to the Security Council and has implications up until today regarding Israel's ability to act in the international community. So according to American practice, as long as the president is in office, he's entitled to make decisions. The process of working on this plan has been in the pipelines for the last 3.5 years. The reason that we are somewhat in a slight deadlock is because Prime Minister Netanyahu wasn't able to form a coalition that he would basically go ahead with this plan as he wished. But he has now a coalition with Blue and White. Up until today, it wasn't clear where Blue and White stand. Today, Benny Gantz, for the first time, actually spoke out and said that he's for the plan. It is yet to be heard what exactly the foreign minister, Gabi Ashkenazi, is saying, because we do know that he has been addressing some Democrats in the United States. He hasn't spoken out as clearly as Benny Gantz spoke out today. But both parties, before they were elected, both Likud and Blue and White, were both advocating for applying Israeli law in the Jordan Valley before the elections. So if you're looking at the Israeli map, you will see that there is more or less consensus that we need to go forward with some sort of process, more or less parallel to what the administration has suggested. And adding upon that, even if we will postpone it until the elections in the United States, it seems like the Israeli public is on this in the same page. I'll just add one more point, and that's regarding the Jewish majority. I think all the plans in the past, including this one, takes into understanding the problem that we have if there will be just a one state. And that's why the Oslo Accord established the issue of a Palestinian Authority with their ability to elect their officials and have their own prime minister, their own president. This plan talks about it as well in order to maintain the right of the Palestinian people to actually vote for their own leadership. The fact that they haven't exercised it for the last 14 years is something which is extremely bothersome for people like us who believe in democracy. But it's definitely in the plan. It was definitely in previous plans in order to maintain and protect the Jewish majority of the state of Israel. So I understand from Mark's appearance on the screen that this is where I have to shut up. So the mic is yours, Mark.
Okay, Mayor, and to all your panelists, thank you so much. Let's hear some questions now from our Q&A. You can please add into the chat. We'll try to get to a couple of them before the top of the hour here. First, Ambassador Shapiro, can you comment on Mayor Ravivi's comments about the involvement of the U.S.? Is it true that Israelis don't want this? What's your thoughts?
Well, I don't want to speak for Israelis about what Israelis do or don't want. It is rather noteworthy how low-key the debate is in Israel about this issue. Many who are, there are some people who feel strongly about it, but many Israelis who see that it could happen think it won't have any significant change. They don't see much chance for peace talks resuming, and the areas being discussed, they do believe Israel has some claim to it, but they don't think it's a necessarily big deal. And others think it's not going to happen, think that this is political gamesmanship. And eventually Prime Minister Netanyahu will find an off-ramp or a reason to delay it. So it's interesting that there's actually a rather muted discussion about it going on. There was one poll that asked Israelis what the most pressing issue for the government to deal with, the new government is, and about 60% said the economic crisis, and about 20% said the coronavirus, and 4% said annexation. And I guess that's from opponents and supporters. So it's not clear, I don't want to speak for Israelis, but there is some evidence of that. I would say that there is one very notable change that has occurred during this process, and I don't know exactly what to attribute it to. As I mentioned earlier, Prime Minister Netanyahu has really drilled into my head and the head of many American officials who we spoke to, his determination to prevent Israel from becoming a binational state. In fact, he told us that he would explain to advocates for annexation in the West Bank in his own party that it really is untenable with Israel to remain both a Jewish and democratic state, would have to make a decision on whether or not to provide citizenship. Now, it's true, that's if you're talking about the full West Bank, but that is the danger of getting on this slippery slope and starting with 30%, but finding that events force you to end up in control of the entire thing. And that was his position for a long time. Now, he said in 2009, he supported a Palestinian state, a demilitarized Palestinian state that recognizes a Jewish state. 2015, he said that he would not see a Palestinian state come into being on his watch. But until April 2019, just a week or so before the election that month, he had never, ever talked about annexation. It's only in that last year and a couple of months that he has adopted that, obviously coinciding with the work on the Trump plan. So I don't know exactly what the cause was, but that's a very noteworthy change. One last note, Mark, if I may, just on the question of the two states. It was noteworthy that Oded mentioned that what would result if the Palestinians meet various conditions and during the negotiations is a Palestinian state. That is actually not the position of the Israeli government. Well, there's one Israeli official who has used that term. The Israeli ambassador in Washington just published a piece in the Washington Post this weekend where he said this would be a realistic two-state solution. But the prime minister and all the other ministers in the government, when they are confronted by some of Oded's colleagues and neighbors who actually oppose the plan precisely because they oppose a Palestinian state in principle coming into being on any land, they are told by the government, don't worry, there's not going to be a Palestinian state. There'll be some, very limited autonomy, but it won't be a state. So there's a little bit of confusion here about even what the status of that Palestinian entity that's envisioned to remain on the 70% even has.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mayor Ravivi, from your perspective, so why do many Israelis living on the West Bank oppose this plan? Perhaps you could speak to that.
I think Dan made the argument very well. I think those who oppose it are definitely those who don't want to see an option of a Palestinian state happening in this region. However, polls have been taking place in Judea and Samaria, and the vast majority of the Jews living in Judea and Samaria are in support of this plan. Those who are against it showed up to the Prime Minister with 6 mayors. I showed up to the Prime Minister with 12 mayors supporting it. It's important to know at the end of the day, the breakdown of the population, the Jewish population in Judea and Samaria, between a third to half are ultra-religious Jews, what we call Haredim, who've moved mainly because of community reasons, because of cost of living, not because of ideological reasons. We've got about a quarter secular Jews who are concentrated in places like Ma'ale, Adumim, Ariel, and small towns bordering the Green Line, like Bet Ariel, Farim, Har Adar, who also haven't moved because of ideological reasons. Only the last third will amount to modern Orthodox Jews, that even within them, you've got those who've moved because of ideological reasons and those who've moved because of other reasons. I think Dan made the point clear that those who are very vocal, who are against because they don't want to see a Palestinian state. And as I said, we have already the Palestinian Authority. We have areas already today that we can't go in. And again, one of the anchors of this plan is understanding that nobody is going to be pushed out of their houses. And I think that is why I would expect people like Dan actually supporting this plan, because it's more or less the vision of those who do want to see a two-state solution. And he's absolutely right in saying that the definition of that state, how will that state actually be, depends a lot on what the Palestinians will do. And as the current American ambassador said, if the Palestinians will become Canadians, you can understand that Israel will be much safer and the border will look like between the United States and Canada.
Okay. Mayor, thank you. So this is for Shira. So, or anyone else wants to jump in, but Shira, what are the risks of not moving forward? Are there risks to maintaining the status quo?
Thank you. Just before that, I just want to point out that Dan mentioned the op-ed by Ron Dermer, Ambassador Ron Dermer in Washington, that spoke about a realistic two-state solution. You just need to know that the translation to Hebrew in Israel Hayom did not mention a two-state solution. They translated it in Hebrew into solution for two peoples. So in Hebrew, the two states does not, and the acceptance of the Trump plan is not synonymous with annexation. And I think Mayor Ravivi spoke about those two as if they're one, but actually we're not talking about the same thing, because really the Palestinians are not accepting the Trump plan, and many people in Israel are not accepting the Trump plan. Another pushback I just want to make on this is that we gave the Palestinians a veto over negotiations, which is true, but now you're giving inadvertently a veto to the Palestinians on their normalization of Israel's ties with the Arab world. The Arab world has been tacit about the status quo, and we'll get to the status quo in a moment, but the Arab world was tacit about it. The international community has been tacit about it. No one has been pushing Israel to do anything for the moment, because the Palestinians have said no to other initiatives, because the world is fatigued, because there are other issues, because it's not a priority. And all of a sudden it became a priority of the international community. I just heard that Qatar is the country that sponsors the Gaza Strip, that prevents another round of fighting between Israel and Hamas, and they don't care about the PA at all, the Palestinian Authority at all, but they just said that they can look like they're complicit in helping Israel annex territory, so they're going to suspend aid to the Palestinians. So this is, I mean, we have to talk about these things. These are very concrete, short term, and there's the longer term. You know, the status quo at the current cost benefit analysis, I would say, and we actually, Dan Shapiro wrote a forward to a study that I authored for Israel Policy Forum, and where we assessed that for the moment, from a cost-benefit analysis, maintaining the status quo looks like the most plausible and sensible option, because really, as I said, the world has come to accept the current situation between Israel and the Palestinians. There's not violence, not too much violence. Israel does not manage the lives of Palestinians, and it does not want to manage the lives of Palestinians. And Israeli officials are protected in a sense in the ICC, the International Criminal Court, because there is this idea, a commitment to negotiations. Commitment to solving issues, you want to call it applying the law, extending sovereignty. Actually, by the way, it's applying the law to extend sovereignty. Applying the law is the means to extend sovereignty. And you can say that the land is disputed or not, but you do this in negotiations. And what an annexation does is sort of removes that from the status quo and turns it in a different direction. You can argue that the status quo, continuing it without moving forward, and that's a big question, because I think the annexation threat in itself has already got the genie out of the bottle. I don't know if it can move it back in. Annexation in itself, if we continue just, expanding settlements because, people have children and they need to grow their houses, and people move to Judea and Samaria because it's beautiful for quality of life reasons or ideological reasons, could eventually lead to a situation where it's impossible to divide the land. And we might end up in the same situation as we are, but at least you're keeping the option of having more sensible leadership and on the Palestinian side. And this could happen. I want to remind everyone, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, he's 86 years old. He might live very long, but he's, smokes like a chimney. There could be new leadership at one point, and the situation could change. There have been changes in the world before. The fear is that a really radical shift from the status quo now closes the doors on this possible change in the future.
Well, on the Palestinian point you just mentioned, and this is open to anybody on the panel who wants to chime in. We have time for just one or two brief questions here. So what conditions are necessary for Abbas to be encouraged to enter some form of negotiations? And again, I open it up to anyone on the panel who wants to take it.
If I may, I think listening to Shira definitely raises, as far as I'm concerned, an eyebrow. For years, Israel has been criticized that we're not doing enough in the negotiation arena, that we're not pushing forward to negotiations. And here there is an opportunity to start a deal. And people are saying, no, let's stick with the status quo. We've been criticized of the status quo. We've been criticized that the Palestinians are not moving forward. And here there is an option to move forward. And now people are suggesting, no, let's stay where we are. Now, why should Mahmoud Abbas agree? Why should the Palestinians agree to a lesser offer that was on the table when John Kerry was negotiating? And I think this is what is important to note also about this plan. It's not only just changing the way things are being presented, but it's really giving the Palestinians an indication that if you carry on missing an opportunities, you don't know when is the next opportunity going to show up, and it's probably going to be smaller than what has been on offer up until now. And therefore, it's an indication, take what you can, just like I'm saying to my people, take what you can, because this is what's on the table now. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know what opportunities. Maybe there'll be an even more chaotic situation in the future, maybe less responsible leaders in the future. Now we know what we have on the table. It's an opportunity to take for both sides. You see the criticism on both sides, which means it's a good compromise because everybody is giving something up, which is painful for him to give up.
Well, Ambassador, do you want to chime in on that, or?
Just in one sentence, the Palestinians bear a lot of responsibility for previous failed negotiations or negotiations they stayed away from or rejected reasonable offers. But the notion that and I don't expect any negotiations as long as the current Palestinian or Israeli leadership are in office. It will almost certainly have to be under different leadership. But the notion that this plan developed essentially unilaterally between Israel and the United States with no Palestinian participation, again, they bear some responsibility for that. But the notion that they will accept that as a basis for negotiations is belied by anybody who has talked to any Palestinian leader or the Palestinian public. In fact, the mainstream of the younger generation of Palestinians are looking well past two states or well past anything that this plan would define, and are simply starting to talk about one state. Just they want the rights of citizenship for all people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. That's the growing stream, and I think the international community will follow them if this is the direction of things on the ground.
So as a last question, I know we're heading to the top of the hour here, and this is for each of you to just give a very brief take on it. It's not a simple question, but how do these potential actions move us closer to peace? Like your very brief thoughts on that before we wrap up. Shira, you want to start us off?
Again, something needs to happen. I think the main advantage of this talk of annexation, and if you want, the introduction of the Trump plan, that it indicates to the Palestinians that time is not on their side. That if they keep waiting and they keep being inflexible, it will not play in their favor. And in that regard, you might say that with new circumstances, a new leadership and the PA, maybe some shifts in Israel. You know, now there's a different government in Israel. Maybe we will see some movement again, depending on the change in administration in the U.S. as well. But I'm really scared about the other peace treaties that Israel already has. King Abdullah will not meet Prime Minister Netanyahu. He will not meet him. He will not see him, whether if there's annexation July 1 or there's no annexation on July 1, because I don't think the Israeli government is going to say, you know what, we decided we're not going to annex. Dan spoke about Jordan. Jordan is a key pillar of security also for the United States interest in the region. It's not just Israeli. This is a concern. So, you know, from the perspective of how it advances peace, I just don't have a good answer. I don't see it.
Mayor?
I have to say, hearing both Shira and Ambassador Don Shapiro, I think the audience has to understand that this is a good plan. Because even if we accept that the majority of the young generation of the Palestinians are really looking for a one-state solution, because they have lack of trust in their administration. And if we started off this discussion with the importance of Israel staying a Jewish and democratic state, I think we need all to unite our efforts to try and help President Trump, whether we support him or not, to go forward with this initiative, because it might really be the last opportunity, because we don't know what's coming after, to really move to what a lot of the people in this audience were active for many years about a two-state solution. It might not be in the borders that they dreamt about. It might not be in the same level of statehood that they thought of, but I think this plan gives us an opportunity, and it might be the last one to actually take and secure all the things which are important both for us, for you, and for the international community.
Ambassador, we'll give you the last word here.
Thank you. Well, I don't think this plan or either the Trump plan itself or the unilateral annexation will move us closer to peace. I think it'd be a mistake. And again, my focus is primarily on U.S. interests, so I can't sugarcoat that. But I guess there's a silver lining, perhaps, and that is that President Trump did actually put his plan in the rhetorical framework of a two-state solution. It's not a realistic two-state solution. I disagree with my friend Oded that this is anything that would even bring about negotiations, much less a viable two-state solution. And to get to a true two-state solution, obviously the Palestinians have many, many hurdles to clear that they haven't cleared, recognizing Israel's legitimacy as a Jewish state and making clear there isn't going to be a right of return of Palestinians to the state of Israel, and really grappling with Israel's very legitimate security needs. Those are all things that didn't occur in previous negotiations. So we'll have to, in the next real negotiation, we will have to find ways to get them to make those historic compromises and Palestinian leaders to tell some very hard truths to their own people. But the silver lining is that President Trump's plan does, for the first time in his administration, use the label and the framework of a two-state solution, which allows a future administration, maybe a Democratic administration, whether it's in 6 months or 4.5 years, to say, you know what, we will continue to work in that framework of two states. Our version of it will have different borders and different maps than the President Trump's version. Our version will have different levels of sovereignty for the Palestinian state. It will always be sovereignty compromised, demilitarized in some other ways, but not to the degree that is described in the Trump plan, which is not a state by any measure. But it does allow that adjustment to take place when there's different leadership on the US side and perhaps different leadership on the Israeli and Palestinian sides as well.
Well, thanks to everyone for joining today, and a special thanks to Ambassador Shapiro, Mayor Ravivi, and Dr. Efron for sharing their expertise with us on this call. We will aim to continue to inform on these very complex issues that are happening very much in real time. So that's what our commitment is here at the Jewish Federations. We're grateful for your time, and I would like to thank everyone who took the time to join us. Stay safe and well. Thank you.